Well, Ceann Corla, firstly I'd like to welcome Maíria Cahill to the Dáil today. I'd like to commend her courage, and I'd like to commend her courage in asserting her integrity as well over these last few months. I utterly deplore those alleged Republicans who've sought to denigrate her stand. I wish to deal here with the disgraceful treatment of Maíria Cahill by members of the institutions of the IRA, and to say that the approach of the Socialist Party and the Anti-Austerity Alliance is the vindication of Maíria Cahill and the protection of victims of abuse first and foremost. This is in contrast to those sections of the political establishment and of the billionaire-owned media who have utilised the criminal abuse and the victimisation of women and children, primarily to deal a blow against their political adversaries, Sinn Féin. And the shameful actions and the cover-up by members of Sinn Féin and of the IRA follows the self-same type of cover-up that we've seen again and again in this state under the political control for decades of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Labour Party. For example, we have a government redress scheme for women, survivors of symphysiotomy, women who've had their bodies butchered, and it's a without fault liability scheme which the women don't support. So that's the kind of treatment that you've given to women. Now, the actions of Sinn Féin and the IRA in the treatment of Maíria Cahill, both then and now, are reprehensible, including by TDs and high-profile members of Sinn Féin. I have in front of me a tweet from the 3rd of November by a Sinn Féin member in my own area of Dublin West. And what it says is hashtag Dublin West at Sinn Féin Ireland, poll rating 26%, post anti-Sinn Féin fest, and it's tagged to Maíria Cahill. I think that's utterly disgraceful. To add to her experiences that she's had. And what it says, fair to point out, majority accept Sinn Féin position on this issue, Captain Black. I think that that kind of thing should be utterly condemned by Sinn Féin, to add to a rape victim's horror. Now, faced with serious allegations, it's clear that Sinn Féin moved to, at the expense of the victim, to cover up and to circle the wagons for their own party. Sinn Féin's priority was not the abuse or the victim. It was to prevent the victim from publicly speaking with other women, which is what she was doing at the time. And in so doing, you have covered up rape and sexual abuse, just as the church did, and it's totally unacceptable. Now, how should rape victims be treated when an allegation comes to light like this? Firstly, they should be listened to and not disbelieved. Secondly, they should be supported and encouraged to avail of counselling. And thirdly, they should be free, if they choose to go to the police or to go to the authorities to prosecute the case. That's their choice. My understanding is that it was the choice of Maíria Cahill and her family at that time, and she should have been supported in that. Now, there were difficulties in going to the RUC in Catholic working class communities. That is absolutely true. But that was the choice of the Cahill family. But just to say, going to the police for any rape victim is a very difficult thing. We saw a report out today where 1 in 7 rape victims reported that they didn't feel they got proper treatment from the Gardaí, for example. So it isn't compulsory to insist that a victim must do that, but they should be supported if they choose to. An alleged abuser should be immediately suspended from any organisation, which wasn't done in this case, removed from women, removed from young people. But incredibly, Sinn Féin members and the IRA grilled and interrogated the victim, used threats, subtle threats, to prevent her going to the RUC. Now, Sinn Féin's defence all through this has been, and the defence of other paramilitaries, loyalists as well, that they had to police working class communities, that there was a void in the policing system where the police weren't trusted by the people, they had to step in. But I contend that the methods of paramilitarism, of secret armies, actually mitigates against women against working class people having any democratic rights or say in the process. They acted as self-appointed judge, jury and executioners in many cases. We have, how would that, for example, justify, a discredited RUC justify a victim being brought on her own, without any support and against her wishes, and forced to confront her own attacker? How would the lack of policing in an area justify that behaviour? It's completely unjustifiable and should be condemned. It's an outrageous treatment of any woman. Now, I think we need to recognise that there is in our society an inbuilt inequality for women in this country and in this society, both economically and socially. There's a rape culture which often justifies rape, blames the victim and seeks to not believe women. I call on Sinn Féin now to acknowledge that Maíria Cahill was raped, to admit that her treatment was completely wrong, to take action against party members who are harassing her online, and I call for the reopening of her case and of all other sexual crimes which clearly weren't properly investigated, which is why I believe Maíria Cahill withdrew her case. And just finally, there are many other issues which could be touched on in this debate. There are other sexual crimes that need to be investigated, like the Kincora scandal, the role of the PSNI and of both governments also suited to cover up this crime at the time to bring Sinn Féin into the peace process. But I think my main point today would be to recognise that this woman was completely mistreated, that it shouldn't have happened, and Sinn Féin should take action and own up.
Now call on Deputy Paul Murphy. 7.5 minutes.
I also want to pay tribute to Maíria Cahill for her bravery in coming forward as a victim of sexual abuse. The shame and tragedy here is that none of the institutions that could have or should have acted in the interests of the victim, in this case of Maíria. The IRA did not. When it acted to cover up the crime of one of its members, when it acted to confront a victim with her abuser, when it moved abusers into different jurisdictions, it was not acting in the interests of the victims. And neither did the British state. That point should be noted, which on the one hand wanted to use Maíria and other victims to prosecute people for membership of the IRA, which is an entirely separate question, and which on the other hand, elements of the British state to supposedly protect the peace process wanted these allegations, wanted these cases to go away. I don't believe that the establishment parties here in the South have acted in the interests of Maíria or other victims either, by using this issue in the way that they have to strike what are political blows, to use it as a political stick to beat Sinn Féin with for purposes that relate entirely to their position in the opinion polls. There is no question that they're the things that have to change, that the victim should come first, the victim should be at the centre in terms of how we deal with sexual abuse. And there's no question that sexual abuse, as has been mentioned by many different speakers, is absolutely and horrifically rife in the South, in the North, right across our societies. And in the North, of course, it's not just the IRA that was guilty. It's not just the IRA that had sexual abusers within its ranks. Amongst loyalist paramilitaries, there are horrific stories of abuse and of cover-up. Like Ruth Coppinger spoke about the British state itself, that the role that it played in the Kincora home scandal is outrageous, and in reality a cover-up continues, whereby there was systematic abuse and rape of young boys by senior unionists, with the British state in the form of the RUC and MI5 being entirely aware of it and using that knowledge not to prosecute those people for abuse, but instead to use them for its own ends. So the IRA are not the only ones who are guilty, but they are guilty here, and I think the guilt should be accepted. I think it's welcome that the point is accepted that Maíria Cahill was abused, but she was, in my opinion, subject to a second abuse, which was the process of the investigation, how that was conducted, being confronted by her abuser, and then what happened being a cover-up. Instead of acceptance of that, instead we have different stories put about by the Republican movement. I think in the North and on social media, you do have one story put about, which is it points towards victim blaming, in my opinion, and there have been really quite atrocious remarks on social media, baiting of Maíria Cahill, attacks on Maíria Cahill's character, the sharing of the blog that many people will have seen, which outrageously raises the question, was this possibly a year-long clandestine sexual relationship between these two people? That is victim blaming. There is no other word for it than that, and that has been shared by prominent Sinn Féin members and should be condemned. And the other things that have gone on in social media and continue to go on in a word of mouth means happening at this time. The other main story, or the other main response, is the idea that there was no alternative, that given the attitudes, which are absolutely understandable and based on reality of experience, the attitudes of working class communities, in particular Catholic communities in the North, the attitudes of the REC meant that that was no alternative and there was no other option but for the IRA to engage in this process and what ultimately turned into a cover-up. In my opinion, there was an alternative, there is an alternative. That alternative was to be supportive of Maíria Cahill's choices, including her right to choose to go to the police, while understanding the reasons that many women would choose not to, but also not to rely upon an unaccountable army as judge, jury and executioner, but instead to have a democratic and open, a community-based and victim-centred approach. That alternative existed and it still exists. I think what we need now is an acknowledgement, not just that Maíria Cahill is telling the truth about the abuse that she suffered, but also about the cover-up that then she was subjected to. An acknowledgement that these things happened, that they were wrong, that they shouldn't have happened, and that they won't happen again in the future. And that all historical cases of child abuse, of sexual abuse, should now be properly investigated, with prosecutions against perpetrators and against all those accused of covering up. Thanks.